May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be pleasing in your sight, O God, our rock and our redeemer. Okay, pop quiz time. We'll see who's been paying attention. Every time I read out of the lectionary, I usually complain about it, right? There's usually something I'm cranky about. What is it that I'm usually cranky about? I'm not cranky about the Old Testament, no. It's a lot to be cranky about. No. Martha. Well, we're going to talk about Martha. Yeah. Okay, so the lectionary, right, is a 3-year cycle of scriptures that gives us a chunk of verses that we're supposed to talk about every week. But what it does is it rips everything out of context, right? So we have this section of Luke chapter 10, right? And who remembers what the gospel reading last week was? I know you've slept several times since then. Do you remember? So last week we talked about the Good Samaritan. So in the life of the church, we kind of think of these things as two separate incidents. You know, we have the parable of the Good Samaritan, which we heard, and then we have this story of Mary and Martha. But what is kind of obscured by the fact that we're talking about them on 2 different weeks is that they are right next to each other. So in Luke chapter 10, you have the parable of the Good Samaritan, and then you have this story about these 2 women and hosting right next to each other. So what would you say is the primary kind of message of the Good Samaritan? Love your neighbor. Love your neighbor in action, right? That the person who does the best by the person who's been wounded is the person who actually helps meet his physical needs, right? After he's been beat up by robbers and kind of left in a ravine for dead, right? So we have in the Gospels multiple times, kind of all over the place, the placement of stories is not by accident. So we have this story about loving your neighbor with action in deed right next to this story about working really hard. Why do you think they are right next to each other? To give me something to explain to you. Oh no. Someone 2,000 years ago wrote this and was like, Mallory's going to have a time with this sermon. What? To think about the point of why you're working. Thanks, Dave. Yeah, right? Like, let's do a little kind of school English class compare and contrast, right? So on one side, we have a story where people who are very holy and very learned walk right on over the person who's wounded, and Jesus is like, this is not the thing, right? Which we talked about last week. And then we have this story of these 2 women, where in public space, we have a private space in a home, and we someone who is working really hard to make everything work. And then you have Jesus saying, that also isn't quite it. Even though that Martha was vested in caring for people's bodies, for feeding them, to making sure that they are comfortable, there's something that's in conversation there about action, right? We need action. Good. That's the lesson we take away from the Good Samaritan. And also, we need stillness. So I'm going to just kind of bracket that and say this story of Mary and Martha has been used to shame women for a very long time. Because no matter how much you do or how well you do it, you're doing it wrong. That's usually how this story is read. People say, oh, you're such a Martha. But it's like, like a backhanded compliment, like you're working too hard and you're too harried and everything's, you're too invested and you don't have time for stillness. And so these women who have been the backbone of the church for as long as the church has been around, this story is used to shame them because they're not spiritual enough. They're too invested in caring for people's bodies. But I think this juxtaposition, this placing it right in conversation with the Good Samaritan is important, that's actually not the point of this story. It isn't to shame women who work really hard. And in fact, the way that this story is written, it actually tries to divide the women in the story, right? Martha she's working really hard and she needs help, and that too is holy. And then you kind of have Jesus being a little bit male, paternalistic, being like, oh, Martha, Martha, Martha. Right? I'm not a huge fan of Jesus in this story, if we're going to be completely honest. He makes me cranky. Because Martha, the word is actually ministry. So it says you are caught up in all of your tasks, but the word in Greek is diakonia, your ministry. Martha is doing the hands-on work of making ministry happen. And then the writer, who is portraying Jesus in a particular way, is undermining her service. Now, flip over to Mary, right? Mary is often held up as this paragon of what it means to be a good Christian woman, right? That she is at Jesus's feet and she is learning. And the way that the text is set up is that she's done something better than Martha has by choosing that. But wait a second, we just had this story of the Good Samaritan where action is important. So how is it that Martha is the one kind of getting yelled at a little bit? What are we supposed to do with that? I have tattooed on my arms, Dave, we had this conversation already, a candle with the Latin word for prayer and a shovel with the Latin word for work. I think that is actually the key to how I read this story. That it isn't that stillness is better than work, but that stillness informs our work. That we can get caught up in the tasks and lose the reason why, lose the relationship, lose what actual wealth looks like when we are caught up in the mechanics of making a welcoming space. How many times have we been oriented and missed the opportunity to be present with someone? Jesus is inviting Martha into stillness, not because her action is bad, at least that's how I choose to interpret it, but because she needs a measure of peace and stillness in her life if she is going to keep doing the ministry that she is already engaged in. This is how burnout happens, right? We are so invested in all of the tasks. The pain in this world is so great, and there is such pressure to do something about it. And yes, we are called to action. We are called to grab our shovels and disrupt things. We are called to do something and build something. And also, we are called to stillness. We are called to breath. We are called to our relationship with the divine and with one another. That even taking a few moments to be in Jesus's presence and in conversation and with him can inform how we go about what we do. It is not that stillness is better than action. It is that they are inseparable from each other. If we only act for burnout, we are also headed for uncareful action that we don't think about, right? Because like if you're going down, if you're going down 25 at 95, you're going to miss your exit, right? Or you have a much better chance of doing that, right? But if you can inject stillness into how you go about your action, then your action is linked to that stillness, and it creates right action, or what we call orthopraxy. It isn't all just about what you do, but also how what you know and what you believe and your connection and your relationship with the divine and with one another informs how you go about what you do. These two things are inseparable, just like these two parables are actually inseparable. But we as humans love to put things in boxes, take things out of context, and break them apart from each other. So let's look a second at the first story we read. Also, a story that is used to shame women for not believing hard enough. Right? That a couple verses later, who is often read as an angel or the prophet who is speaking about the future, gets into kind of a back and forth, he said, she said, with Sarah. So he says, Sarah, why did you laugh? And she goes, I didn't laugh. And he goes, yes, you did. And it's kind of this like titty thing. But I wonder about what it means about hospitality, right? That these strangers were coming by, and Abraham and Sarah opened their home to them and offered them hospitality, offered them a place to land, a place to rest, a place to clean up, and a place to be nourished. They were ready for the opportunity to both have stillness and relationship with someone who is other than them, but also act to care for their bodily needs. Both of these things are present in this story. And then what happens? Anybody on Zoom? What happens? What? In the story. They invite folks in, they create a meal for them. Guess what? Your wife's gonna have a baby. This surprise that upends everything they thought they knew of their life was gonna look like. Right? This marriage between contemplation and action, stillness and motion, when we place relationship at the core, surprising things happen. We are asked to host the holy, asked to host the holy other. And it's surprising what happens when that is what guides our decision making. A miracle. Something that can change the entire course of our lives and lives generations after us, a miraculous birth of something. There is power in marrying stillness and action. To be still enough to see you and be driven to action to invest in your life and care about you. I believe that this is what we are called to do as faithful people, to host the holy, to tap into that place where we see one another, we enter into intimate relationship, into me, you see, and also be moved with compassion to act. These things are not separate, just like Mary and Martha are not separate Samaritan, and they are not separate from each other. There are poles here that we've tried to artificially divide from itself, when actually it is an invitation to hold the both and the and. maybe even a challenge to expand our souls large enough to hold it all, to be present, to be hospitable, and to act. So my prayer for us today is that we create the space for stillness so that we can host the holy when it comes to surprise us. Amen.